This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halper. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a professor of history and Israel-Palestine studies in the program in Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her book, Teachers as State Builders, Education and the Making of the Modern Middle East, was published last year by Princeton University Press. She is now in Israel for a conference organized by the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, entitled The British Mandate in Palestine, Regional and Global Contexts. Dr. Hilary Falb-Kallisman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
So your book focuses on teachers in the Middle East during the last chapter of British imperialism, notably under the mandate system of the interwar period. It is a time of great shifts in the political structures and ideologies in the region. What role did teachers play in those changes for which you thought they deserved your scholarly attention?
Teachers were really on the front lines of all of the ideological trends that were happening in the region at the time. So, of course, you have territorial nationalisms, Iraqi, Palestinian, Transjordanian or Jordanian, but you also have communism, Pan-Arabism, even fascism. And teachers being sort of one of the most numerous, kind of groups of literate people in the region, were considering these ideologies, thinking about them, talking about them, and also discussing them with their students.
So would you consider them low-scale public intellectuals?
Yes, particularly during the mandate period. As I mentioned, very few people were literate. So public school teachers, by definition, had to be able to read and write in order to work as a teacher. And this kind of already put them in an elite group.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about the mandate period, you can tell me more about it, but as far as I understand it, as it was, they were somewhat caught between the political structures of empire and, indirect imperialism under the mandate system and emerging nationalism. So at the same time, because there were public servants, they were at the same time loyal to the state, but also loyal to the emerging ideologies.
Yes, this is one of the interesting paradox I found with the position of teachers specifically. So on the one hand, they were working for mandate governments and mandate bureaucracies, right? They got their paycheck from the mandate governments. On the other hand, they're essentially all anti-imperial. None of them want the British to be in control of the region directly or indirectly. And yet they're able to maintain this position in part because education itself was really viewed as a public good. It was something where there was a big demand on the part of the mandate populations for schooling, which meant that teachers, as the people giving schooling, were generally not sort of criticized as being kind of stooges of the British government, but rather were seen as, sort of providing a benefit. And again, often writing or even, writing anti-imperial materials or even leading protests against the governments they were working for.
Mm-hmm. And how did that affect the way that they were seen and perceived and considered by the authorities on the one hand, and the people on the other, and of course the political and ideological elites within those people?
So one thing I do want to emphasize is that there are real differences between the three different mandates that I look at in this book. The mandate for Iraq, it's technically only an official mandate until 1932, but Iraq is subject to some degree of British control until 1958. That said, in education, Iraq is the least controlled by the British out of the three mandates. So what this means is, kind of after 1923, the education system is mainly being controlled by Iraqi citizens. So this means they may have, sort of similar interests to some of the teachers. They may go to the same clubs and parties as the teachers. They may have disparate ideologies, as sort of Iraq is kind of a hotbed of both fascism and communism, and teachers were participating in both, as well as sort of Iraqi nationalism.
So that means that they got a certain degree of autonomy?
Yes. And it also meant Iraq was the biggest importer of teachers from throughout the region out of the three mandates. So, right, it has more control over its budget than the other mandates, which means it wants to expand education, which means it brings in Palestinian and Syrian and Lebanese teachers in particular, who tend to have a more pan-Arab ideology. So what this means is, sort of these teachers were kind of perceived, and again, it depends on which village, which group in Iraq, as you mentioned, public intellectuals, but also, sort of people who were on the cusp of politics, and sometimes even, kind of, they could be a politician who was on the outs with whatever particular configuration of Iraq's government was going on at the time. And so they were going to teach for a year or two in a high school or the teacher's college before going back into the political game. And this is similar in Jordan as well. The British saw education in Jordan as a bit of an afterthought, but they restricted the government's budget pretty heavily, other than funding given to the Jordanian Legion in order to sort of police the region as the British would like. So what this meant is teachers in Jordan tend not to be from Jordan. They tend to be from Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria as well. And, sort of teaching is very much seen as kind of a elite profession, or a profession that elites do sometimes. So for example, there's some people I talk about in my book, the Attal family, where, sort of Mustafa Attal is the poet laureate in Jordan, but he alternates being a teacher with being a governor, with being a judge, with getting kicked out of these professions because he's also an alcoholic. But it's something where a lot of people who then became government ministers in Jordan spent a few years teaching. And lastly, the mandate for Palestine is very different. Palestine was under much more British control, in part because the British were trying to juggle the two different national projects of the Jewish Zionist movement and the Palestinian Arab movement, while having it written into the mandate charter that they were really only supposed to favor the Zionist one. Education was seen as a hotbed of nationalism by the British, so this meant they actually tried very hard to control Palestinian, like Arab Palestinian education in particular. So it's in the mandate for Palestine where you really get teachers whose views are very much at odds with their government and their government policies.
Mm-hmm. And really, how did it, I'm more interested, I have plenty of questions about all three, but since we're talking about Palestine, how did it, this division between the two national projects, between two communities, came to the fore?
Well, on a technical level, the school system of the Jewish community in Mandate Palestine, the Yishuv, was defined as a religious school system. So that allowed that system much more autonomy, so they could sort of control curricula. And of course, there's a lot of infighting between different groups within the Jewish community about, do they want to be more religious? Also, how can they get British funding without having to listen to the British about what they're teaching? Whereas for Palestinian Arabs, they were, sort of not allowed to control their own curriculum to the degree they wanted to. They weren't, sort of able to make as many decisions about, sort of particularly history, Arab nationalism, etc., as they wanted to.
Were they affected by the parallel Zionist school system? I mean, was there any exchange? Was there any mutual, cross-pollination even?
So a little bit. So there's actually an excellent book by a friend of mine, Yoni Furas, who looked at sort of both the Jewish and the Palestinian Arab school systems, focusing on history teaching. And, he did an excellent job looking for connections between them, but there really weren't that many. That said, I'm currently working on a project on the history of standardized testing in the region. And actually in the Mandate for Palestine, standardized testing is one of the few places where you do get Jewish, Arab, British, missionary, American educators sitting down together and working through what do they think should be on the test and who should take it.
When you said about all three mandates that the British had different levels of control over the school system, does that mean in terms of budgeting, in terms of controlling the curriculum and the content that they are being taught? Is it certain subjects, the more ideological one, whether it's history or whatever, as opposed to sciences? I mean, what was the ideological component in that control?
So basically, like, there was some degree of British control in all of these things. That said, budgetary control, I think, is the most important one when looking at Iraq and Jordan. It's something where in the 5th chapter of my book, where I talk about when the mandates become independent, you see, sort of once there is less British control, there's a skyrocketing in the number of schools, teachers, students, and funding devoted to education. That said, in terms of ideology, the British are not particularly concerned with what's going on in Jordan most of the mandate period. In Iraq, they get very concerned in the late 1930s and early 1940s because of the rise of fascism and its ties to Pan-Arabism. And there's actually a war, right, between Iraq and the British in 1941, after which there's a crackdown on the Iraqi curriculum and teachers in particular. And that sort of recedes in later years. In Palestine, the concern with sort of curricula is the British, from other colonial experiences, really understand that, sort of when they're in control of a region, education tends to lead to anti-British nationalism. So in Palestine, they would like that not to happen. But the British, right, the mandates are meant to be self-sustaining. The British taxpayer isn't supposed to pay for it, which means the British are not particularly interested in spending lots of money to have tons of inspectors making sure that every teacher is teaching how wonderful Britain is. Mm-hmm. Instead, they sort of try to kind of make sure that the textbooks aren't overtly anti-British or anti-Zionist, but a lot of what they're sort of their way of kind of cracking down on what's going on with education is just not to fund it.
Another interesting aspect is that you mentioned earlier the movement of teachers between countries, between mandates, that it is under the mandate system, as I understand it, maybe not before, that they became truly transnational actors. And that is really interesting because until I read your book, I thought that teachers were perhaps most quintessential community figures, right? Like, I don't know, like clergymen even, or local business people. To what extent was this movement, I mean, I understand that it was really pervasive, but how did it start? How did it sustain itself? What was the purpose of it? Can you tell us the ins and outs of it?
Sure. So part of my argument in the book is that the movement of teachers is actually set up during the Ottoman period. Now, in that period, it's not transnational because all of these teachers are under the Ottoman Empire. But basically, because you don't have very many institutions of higher learning within the empire, you're starting to get more. But what this means is if you want to go to secondary school or high school, you need to travel usually to the kind of capital of your province. If you want to go on for higher education, you usually need to go to Istanbul or to go abroad. And if you want to teach, you can also be, sort of stationed at any of these schools. Also, sort of particular areas provide hubs that once you get the borders of the mandates after World War I, those areas are suddenly in other countries. So with the mandates, you have people sort of understanding that, okay, if I want to go to high school, I'm likely to have to travel unless I already live in the capital city of my province or now mandate. And also kind of knowing that if you are a teacher, you could be stationed anywhere within it. Now, one of the big, kind of differences in the mandate period is that the American University of Beirut becomes a big hub. It was starting to, sort of gain traction in the late Ottoman period. But the British speak English. The American University of Beirut is a university that will teach students in English for a lot of their classes. And it's close. So you have a lot of people who say, okay, like if I want to teach high school, I need a post-high school degree. So I'll go to Beirut and I'll teach. And then they will go teach all over the region. So you have a lot of people, kind of from Palestine, from Syria, even from Lebanon, getting their BA at the American University of Beirut, then go teaching a few years in Iraq, teaching a few years in Jordan.
What was there a bureaucratic system in charge of this, or was it like down to the personal initiative of each one of them?
Well, so there's an alumni system, right? So there's a kind of old boys and girls network where, you would have governments who now had a lot of people who had graduated from the American University of Beirut looking to that university to hire people to come teach.
I would think that they would, go gain a degree and come back to their communities. Again, teachers being such a part and parcel of community fabric.
Well, I think so. What I found in this book is that there was the hope that that would kind of be the end goal a lot of the time, in part because it was more expensive to import teachers, right? Like you have to pay somebody more if they're coming from Lebanon or Palestine than you do if they're local. But on the other hand, there was, sort of on the part of the Iraqi government, a big belief in Pan-Arabism. This was one way of actually very concretely contributing to it. On the other hand, as I try to emphasize, particularly in the earlier chapters of the book, there are just so few people with university degrees, right? So it's, if you want, and this is particularly true for female teachers, if you want a woman to teach in a high school with a post-high school degree, she's going to need to have traveled hundreds of miles, whether she's Iraqi and has gone to Beirut or she is from Beirut and has gone to Iraq.
Right. Was there a contribution to Pan-Arabism? I mean, if you had a school with teachers from all over, did it have really a different effect on the curriculum, on school life than, if it was just, people from the same community?
It did. It really did. You see this in student memoirs of the period. So in Jordan has one complete high school for the whole mandate period. So this means literally everyone who goes to school, and they're all men, who goes to school in Jordan.
Just one school in the whole country.
So they have 2 years of high school in a few other places, but only one 4-year institution. So this means literally everyone in the country will have gone to this school. And their teachers tended to be from throughout the region. And, the people who go to this school are then going to become ministers, government officials, technocrats, everything. They write in their memoirs about how elegant and well-traveled their teacher were, and they learned that they were part of an Arab world from them, right? So it was these teachers would both sort of talk about a lot of the time and embody a fluid interwar version of Pan-Arabism.
I'm guessing that you focused on these 3 mandates also for practical reasons, because you needed to draw a line somewhere. But I wonder whether you have any insights about the difference between the British mandates and the French mandates. You did say that there was a lot of movement from Lebanon and Syria into the British mandates. I mean, was there any difference in the way all these phenomena that you're describing took place under the French mandate?
So the French actually had more of an interest in curricula, and the French also had a stronger relationship, particularly with the Maronite community in Lebanon, even though the British were kind of trying to cultivate a similar one with the Jewish community in the Mandate for Palestine. In terms of the school systems,
So as to be
Yeah.
their agents, as sort of like a local agents of the empire.
Well,
as
and
it
also,
what does it mean exactly?
like a divide and conquer kind of mentality.
Mm.
So when I'm teaching about this, I have a quote from Ronald Storrs, sort of the governor of Jerusalem, where he says that he hopes the Jewish community will be like a loyal Ulster in a sea of hostile pan-Arabism. So what he's hoping is the Jewish community in the Mandate for Palestine will be sort of loyal to the British because they're supporting them, but also that the Arab community will fight the Jewish community rather than the British.
So what you're saying is that the French had a similar idea with the Maronites. in Lebanon.
Exactly. But the French had a longer standing relationship with that community and had trade relations with that community for a longer time. And also, sort of what I found is that the French were also much more interested in actually imposing a French system than the British were in imposing a British one. What this means is you had more interest on the part of the French in actually, and there's a wonderful new book on this subject by Elizabeth Williams, specifically looking at agricultural education. But basically, the French were interested in having people from Lebanon and Syria go to France rather than go to local agricultural institutions to learn, sort of French expertise. Whereas for the British, they were like, that's too expensive. We don't want to pay for anybody to go to Britain except, maybe like 5 people every year. And that's about it. So,
And how did that affect the movement
so
of teachers?
in terms of the movement of teachers, what I found, right, is that in the British mandates, because again, there's a premium on learning English, it means you do have sort of more of an importing of people from, sort of a bit more from Palestine to go to Iraq. Now, Iraq is definitely the biggest importer of teachers. Jordan is kind of a second one. Palestine is third. But what I found is this kind of that really like Beirut was this huge hub. Whereas, kind of within the, and it actually, so for Jordan, it kind of replaces Damascus. So it's something where you do still have a movement of teachers from Syria and Lebanon going to Iraq, like you have ones from Palestine going there. But for my book's purposes, it was something where I didn't want to get into the particularities of the French system. I wanted to get into the teachers once they kind of appear in Iraq. And again, the American university played a much kind of bigger role than I saw. And it's not it's not a state school. It's founded by missionaries, and it's also kind of under the auspices of American protection. So it's a bit of a free agent as well.
Yeah, sort of like a Anglo outpost in the French territory.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing about studying teachers is that there's so many of them. I mean, your methodology, as you explain in the book, is a collective biography. But can you unpack this for us? How do you even start tackling such a huge number of people as teachers in these 3 mandates?
Well, I had to balance very different amounts of information on teachers, and to also balance the different numbers of teachers at different times. So, right, in, kind of the 1920s in Jordan, there are like less than 100 teachers. So in Jordan, I can just be like, okay, so I know all of their names. I can look all of them up and see what they did.
All the records survived?
No. Again, very uneven amounts of information. But I was able to get statistics from the Ministry of Education in Jordan, and that meant I could see for a lot of people, when did they start working? Where were they born? Did they get fired? That sort of thing. So the collective biography structure allowed me to make arguments about teachers as a social group. So it means, sort of you can take bigger official data. So from Ministry of Education reports or Department of Education in Palestine, from those records, you can say, okay, so we know there were X number of teachers at this point. We know the names of some of these teachers. I can then kind of make an argument about how many of them are not from or studied abroad from the place where they're now teaching. It allowed me to follow enough of them to be able to make an argument about their social standing. But I also had to change my methodology once Iraq and Jordan became independent, right? Because then suddenly you have thousands and thousands of teachers. And for Palestinians, my methodology had to change too, because they don't end up with a nation state. They're dispersed or they're living under occupation in Israel. And so in this case, I had to look at teachers much more as a statistical aggregate rather than being able to have as many kind of nice, intimate biographies with lots of detail.
Mm-hmm.
So it meant kind of dealing with what I had available.
Yeah. But also you had to pick and choose, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that?
Well, some teachers, again, just had so many more materials available. So, and it a lot of it depended on where I was able to find materials on them. So, for example, one of the teachers I focus on in the Mandate for Palestine, Muhyiddin Haj Isa, was also a playwright. So it's something where I have his teacher's personnel file, and then I have information about him writing plays later, and I could actually read one of them, right? So he was this very interesting figure. He's very rebellious. He smokes and doesn't teach the syllabus in the classroom. But I could follow him. So he was an interesting case. If teachers became prime ministers, a lot of times they would leave behind their memoirs. And as I talk about the book, sort of a third of Iraq and Jordan's prime ministers during the early years of independence were former public school teachers. So then you have more information on them.
And also impressions of other people, students and stuff.
Yes. And so then you would look at memoirs and then you would say, okay, so this person wrote a memoir. They were here at this time. This is likely to have been their teacher. But I can at least talk about their sort of impressions in retrospect if they don't remember the name.
It sounds like an endless jigsaw puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. Well, and it all ended up in this wonderful book, Dr. Hilary Falk-Kallisman, author of Teachers as State Builders, Education and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to please ask you to consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to the website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.